Why do people attack the West, and why within the West does there seem to be a sort of imp of the perverse that wants to destroy everything that gave us what we have?
There are such things as British values, there are such things as Western values. We've got to be confident in what they are, and that is the only way that we will continue to thrive as a society and as a civilization.
The West is under attack. We live in the freest, healthiest and wealthiest societies in human history. Yet as authoritarian and oppressive regimes threaten us from without, a new movement within tells us to feel nothing but shame for who we are. Welcome to the West. This is my take on the great and still unfolding adventure of who we are and why it matters. This is a history of how our extraordinary, unconventional civilization came to be and why it must be defended. It's a fascinating and often unexpected journey, stretching back 15 centuries to the fall of Rome. And it starts with a mystery, the loss of Western self-confidence. What on earth happened to the West?
Hi, you're watching Deprogrammed. I'm Poppy Coburn, and I'm joined today by my co-host, Harrison Pitt, and we've got a really special guest today, and that's Marc Sidwell. He's the author and the presenter of a new 6-part series for the New Culture Forum entitled The West, and it's going to be premiering this Sunday. So, Marc, if I can start you off, what actually is the West? How did you find that? I know that's a big question, but...
It's a very big question, and we had to turn it into a 6-part documentary series to get anywhere even close to answering it. But the West it's a narrative history, the great history of our culture and our civilization. Mm-hmm. And this used to be something that was widely shared and known and taught. I mean, it used to be taught particularly in the US. They had more sort of university level, entry level courses on Western civilization. But here too, you would find it part of the culture. The BBC in the late 80s made The Triumph of the West with John Roberts, a terrific sort of global history of the West and its influence. Margaret Thatcher in the 1990s did a post-Cold War speech in the US where she said, the West isn't just something that we had in the Cold War that helped us define ourselves against communism. It's something that really matters. It's who we are, and it's our values, and that shapes how we, hold ourselves in the future against the future threats that are coming. We need to renew it. And what I was feeling increasingly was that world was going away, and what we needed to do was retell that grand story for a new generation and with new technology. And the inspiration in a way came from the BBC's more recent attempt to revisit Kenneth Clark's Civilization, which is of course a wonderful series from the late 60s. But when they returned to it a few years ago, they made Civilizations, because I think they felt, and they had multiple presenters, I think they felt, well, we can't just tell this one single great story anymore, we have to tell the global story. And it wasn't the worst series. It had Simon Sharma, it had some really interesting episodes, but at the same time it wasn't that tale of the West as a remarkable and unique achievement. And when the West did appear in it, it tended to be as as the baddie and as the colonizer and as all of that.
Well, how do you account for what seems to exist in the culture at the moment, this sort of cringing embarrassment about anything to do with our roots? I mean, why do you think that the West does find itself in the dock?
I think people don't appreciate, and this is why perhaps they may find this a surprising thing to have done, but I think this is at the heart of the culture war. This is really what it is all about. I interviewed Stanley Kurtz in America, and he's a very interesting historian. He's looked at some of the false narratives about the non-existence of the West in the American consciousness. He's written some very interesting historical research about this. But one of the things he points out is really that the idea of the West was the attacks on that, the attacks on the courses in Western civilizations that they had in American universities, particularly say in Stanford, in the late 80s, that was the beginning of America's culture war. Because as soon as you stood up and you said, actually, this course, which was enormously popular, was very successful, the students loved it, but then activists started saying, well, this is racist, you can't do this anymore. And it got shut down. It got shut down as a sort of compulsory course, and then they were trying to do something more multicultural. And multicultural sounds lovely, doesn't it? You know, in a way, we're going to look at other things, and that's important. And one of the things about the West is that its openness to other influences. But what that became very quickly, despite those apparent good intentions, was attacks on the West, an attempt to paint the West as evil. And at the heart of contemporary wokeness is this idea that Western civilization is systemically broken and evil and needs to be torn down and reformed and can't be talked about. So only by defending it, by defending that narrative, can you really begin to fight back, because the hatred of the West, the attempt to throw out that story, is where all of the contemporary madness really begins.
So this does seem to be quite a contemporary development in how quickly, you know, the defence of the West, however you do want to define that, you know, this real attack does seem to have been something that's happened quite recently. And as you mentioned with the BBC, even when they do push for example, a few years ago you would have the we need to take more people's perspective into account. Now it's very explicitly that the West, as we may define it, as European civilization, people and ideologies, is something that's actively bad. So it's not just that, you know, we want to open ourselves up to the contributions made in, you know, the Far East or some early Northern African, you know, contributions to the world. This is uniquely evil. There's something uniquely evil about this ideology, and you see it a lot in the kind of woke mindset. Well, they'll call whiteness is a kind of pejorative, you know, it's something to attack people with. And I'm kind of interested to see how you think that change happened so quickly. You know, what was driving this real hatred of Western civilization, and why has it happened just in the last 10 or so years and really ramped up?
I mean, I think part of what happens really is that behind what to some people seems rather well-meaning, you know, is this sort of multicultural terms. There were very radical people in the academy, and of course this was happening in universities, which is often where there are very radical people. Some of the people behind those protests never had any real interests in sort of widening it out and talking about multiculturalism in some sort of inclusive way that included the West as a partner. They really were concerned about colonial legacies and about some idea of
history,
a deeply criminalized view of what was going on. So then that became the story. And, you know, people worry sometimes about the West, and they accuse it, this sort of narrative, of being illiberal and being something that you were talking about, whiteness, that's the sort of racially exclusionary and all of that. Not at all, not at all. There are times when people try and use it in that way, and I think that's why it's so important to reclaim it. I mean, we talk in the first episode, which people will be able to see this Sunday, about some of the, you know, the great, often quite radical black thinkers who saw themselves very much as part of the West. There's no sense of exclusion there. And the danger when you stop having these mainstream conversations about the West and its importance in a way that brings people in and understands the West as something that, you know, had influence from all over the place, is that you get extremists taking it up and using it in some sort of awful way as white identity or as something very narrow. And this, I think, is an attempt to have a more honest and hopeful conversation about the West as a thing that brings people together and helps people belong. And also, part of what's happened, I think, is in the absence of the West, in the absence of that sort of idea of shared identity, you decline into this endless rivalry of identity because everyone needs some particular identity, and it's a world of civil war.
It just becomes a sort of the will to power is the only thing which unites us, and we sort of organise into our own tribal groups, and, you know,
it's very Hobbesian.
Very Hobbesian, and it creates that sense of belonging is completely lost. It's also very true to say as well. I completely agree with you that whereas a lot of what we might call social activism in the past couched itself in overtly Western principles and said things like, you know, Martin Luther King talked about the Declaration of Independence as a sort of promissory note, and I'm here to cash the check. The West needs to live up to its own best principles. That was the sort of pitch made by activists like Martin Luther King. Whereas today, it's completely the other way around. There's this sense that in order to exact the sort of social transformation that we want, we need to completely alienate people from their history, and we need to sort of unmoor them from their roots, because once you've done that, it becomes much easier.
And you can create a new mythology.
Yes.
I mean, I've seen this, I read an excellent article in the magazine I Am 1776, and it was by a writer who wrote about Windrush in the popular imagination, and how, you know, going through kind of contemporary reports at the time, this was like a very, you know, little known actual docking of the ship. The way that it's spoken about now, we act as if like people from all along the country were waiting for these people to come, because we've been begging, you know, people from the West African colonies to come and help us. But in reality, the reason why we have Windrush so prominently in the national consciousness is because under Blair in the late 90s, early 2000s, he commissioned a documentary series which was all about the Windrush story, and this was to kind of push the narrative that Britain is a multicultural country, which it never has been.
And always has been.
Exactly. Yeah. Whereas the reality is the complete opposite. You know, Britain, by being an island nation, is actually incredibly homogenous and has been for the vast majority of history. So we can see that this is something that the left is quite happy to do, which is to, as Harrison said, kind of uproot our own history and plant a new garden full of their own ideological.
Completely true, but it's also, I think, it's incredibly sinister and underhand as well, because there's nothing new about the idea, the revolutionary idea that in order to advance the cause of a radical transformation, you need to alienate people from their history. You need to direct hatred against the past. Every revolutionary from Robespierre to Mao has acknowledged that. But they did it in a very bloody fashion, obviously. The French Revolution saw tens of thousands dead. Mao's Cultural Revolution saw millions killed. And this is something else that you have written about, Marc. The way in which revolutionaries adopted a sort of new modus operandi in the middle of the 20th century, and discovered that, you know, sort of overt political violence wasn't the best route to achieving the sort of radical goals they had in mind anymore. They adopted more Gramscian methods, a sort of long march through the institutions.
Right.
How much does that feature in your documentary as a way of explaining how we've come to be where we are today?
It's not so much in the documentary itself. It's more that having written that book and thought about those things, it turns my mind to the question of these meta-narratives and how important they are. And, you know, this is an episode of The Simpsons that I don't know if you know. It's where
I'm a man of culture, so
you're a man of culture. This is high culture. We have to update high culture. Absolutely. They have the statue in the town of Springfield, and then someone is doing the research into his Lisa, right? The clever child, and she discovers that he was a pirate and he was all of these terrible things, and he didn't really say a noble spirit embiggens the smallest man, which is like what's written on the statue. And it's the whole episode, and this was this little while ago, it's like 10-15 years ago. And then at the end of the episode, she's about to tell the whole town, and then she decides, well, no, this is terrible. We need this story. We need to be inspired by the idea of these things, even if the historical truth is more complicated. Absolutely. So she doesn't actually do it. But of course, we've lost that understanding, and now people are just casually tearing things down. They don't understand. With the West, what they do, they conflate two things. You know, they talk about the West in the late 20th century, and they say, well, this is being used in this terrible neo-colonial evil way, and they're looking back to the 19th century, where sometimes Western civilization was seen as a thing that justified some quite bad and terrible things that were done around the world. But in the 20th century, post-war, in the 50s, 60s, into the 70s, the West was being used as the term to understand liberal civilization and what that was bringing to the world. Liberal democracy, freedom of speech, all of these things. Indeed, even before that, there were people using the West to understand in the Second World War what the Nazis were, how un-Western they were, how poisonous they were, and to stand against them. And so what they don't realise when they do all of this neo-colonial stuff, harking back to 19th century things, is they don't understand what the West had become and what it stood for. And when they tear it down, that's what they're tearing down. They're tearing down the defence of free speech, the defence of liberal democracy. And so now that they've stopped teaching it, now they've thrown out the West, we suddenly find all of these things are out the window.
Yeah, I mean, if I may, you've mentioned liberalism, and liberalism is something that you can't really disentangle from the West. And liberalism to me is not something that actually exists anymore. It was a historical precedent that grew out of the previous age of enlightened absolutism, which came through the feudal system. So these were material responses to the issues of the day. That's why we have parliamentary supremacy. That's why we have media freedoms. That's why we have freedom of association. These were things that came out of the historical context. And I think what we've seen happen in the last 100 or so years is you've seen liberalism as it was supplanted with democracy, or mass democracy as it is today. And I think what a lot of wokeism is, ironically, is rooted in some of these historical structures, and that this is mass democracy taken to its furthest conclusion. This is the idea of the right of the mass to overrule those individual rights, just taken further. And so of course the same people that kind of rally against it do have an intellectual tradition that's rooted in this, although that's not to say that your average activist knows this or acknowledges this, and they're not thinking this. Someone trying to pull down the statue of Winston Churchill is not being influenced by Locke, but it's part of that wider understanding of history as a set of material processes which respond to the issues of the day. And I think if we are to grapple with why the West has fallen in the way it has, we also do need to have that kind of historical background, which is why I think it's so interesting in your documentary. You start at the beginning, or what we popularly imagine to be the beginning, and that's the classical world. I'd be interested if you could speak a little bit about why you chose to begin the documentary with the classical world.
Well, it's an interesting thing. What I wanted to do was to do a narrative of the West that was familiar, that was accurate, that was up to date with the latest research, and that kind of addressed some of the newer critiques of it that have come up. So while I do indeed talk about the importance of Rome and Greece as key influences in the West, where I actually start is where Kenneth Clark starts in his Civilization, which is actually with the fall of Rome.
The Dark Ages.
Gibbon.
The Dark Ages as such, but I'm trying to, and this is more of an Enlightenment tradition that's fallen out, to rehabilitate in a way the barbarians, because they did bring something very new and energetic to Western culture, and that traditionally has been understood, but it's rather gone away. But this is also partly to address. So there's a narrative of the critiques of the West, and they say, well, this doesn't really exist. You've just made this up. This whole narrative, because there are lots of people that inherited the classical tradition that was true in the Arab world as well, and there was no pure transmission, and you lost all these Greek books for centuries, and there is some truth in that. There is some truth in that, and but they, of course, just think that means, well, there's no, you just throw out the whole thing, we don't need it. But there is a reality to the West. And in many ways, the reality of what this new thing that began to form, it began to form in the wake of Rome, in this place where you suddenly had a very divided Europe, in some ways a very primitive Europe. And uniquely, that created an environment in which one great empire couldn't take over and dominate, and a few people at the top be in control. And that's, in a way, the freakish thing that happened in the West, perhaps for quite accidental reasons, that allowed it to develop in very, very unusual ways that really didn't happen elsewhere.
The spirit of competition, which existed from that point onwards, is that what you're saying? Because Neil Ferguson, in his book Civilization, the West and the Rest, which seeks to account for the way in which the West, in the modern world, has enjoyed such a preeminent role as compared with China and other places, points to the fact that there were these sort of warring kingdoms in the West, whereas China at the time was this sort of great big, unitary monolith, and that means that there's less likely to be the sort of development there as there is in Western Europe, where there was much more competition between states. Is that important to your narrative?
Absolutely. It's the competition between nations, but it's also the competition within. Of course, there was always the church and the crown, and there was also competing forces when you've got the cities and the commercial interests, you've got the nobles. And in fact, Harrison, of course, you're actually featuring from time to time, because we did do an interview very early on in the process.
I mean, one or two clumsy contributions, which I hope have been skillfully edited.
There was one which I always remembered, which was very good, where you were talking about how the West is a place of rivalry, an intellectual rivalry. How some people didn't like Shakespeare, and it's that sort of fight within the West.
For example, if we were to use the example of feudal China, which had a very bureaucratic system where conformity was really the lodestar.
This is what Ferguson's talking about.
Of course, and that's the difference. That's the kind of one of the unique selling points of why Europe produced such great literature and art, and also why we had so much military supremacy for such a long time.
And the voyages of discovery. So what happened in China is that they actually had extraordinary state capacity. They built these great treasure fleets, they sent them out, but it was run by a court eunuch, And as soon as the emperor decided, well, actually, we're not going to do that anymore, burn down all the ships, ban all the ships. No one is allowed. In Europe, you couldn't do that. Columbus just would go to a different monarch. In fact, it's very interesting. He went to Henry VII in England, and Henry VII said, "Oh yeah, I'll do that." But by the time his brother, who'd been sent, got back to say, England's going to fund your voyage, he'd already left because Ferdinand and Isabella had done it. So history might have been very, very different.
But it is very true, and yet you're right, that is one of the points I did try and get across, is that the West, ever since Socrates, the West has been in a sort of endless dialogue with itself, and often it's been incredibly violent, but it has cultivated this extraordinary sense for this extraordinary love almost of division and questioning and interrogating and revising, and it's dynamic and it's regenerative and all the rest of it, and obviously that accounts for much of its developmental quality over time, and that's a very good thing. But and this speaks to something that Poppy was mentioning earlier. The problem arises, I think, when that sort of relentless attachment to relentless philosophical self-criticism and improvement degenerates into a sense of self-destruction, into a certain kind of appetite almost for suicide in a way.
Pathological altruism, I think, is probably one of the ways that I like to describe how the West's current political quagmire that it's fallen into. Is that so I actually see this a lot in a lot of well-meaning defences of the West that are coming out. And for example, people who are defending Britain's colonial legacy. And what I see from it is I'll see people say, well, look at all the benefits that we brought to our former colonies. We gave them a bicameral parliamentary system. You know, we helped build infrastructure for some of these countries and all of this. And it's like, okay, that's a very valid point, but you're already losing by seeing it only in terms of the people on the outside, rather than realising that this is actually something to be proud of, because it benefited Britain and it benefited the people of Britain, and it allowed for, by constantly seeing our own achievements as from the outside and how they benefit people from outside of our own cultures, and by constantly deferring to the multicultural ideal, we forget ourselves. And I think this is a problem I see a lot in some conservative spaces, where we're so desperate to not be seen as being mean that we actually end up denigrating our ancestors and these great traditions that we are a part of.
And to the extent that we defend them, we only defend them in terms,
of course,
which
of the
ideology
that we live in today, and the kind of moral framework that we live in today.
But yes, but and I don't disagree with that. But the point I was trying to make with the question of suicide, because the thing you were saying earlier, Poppy, you were saying that a lot of this stuff, whether it's sort of French Jacobinism or Soviet communism or totalitarian wokeism such as exists today, one of the awkward questions that I think exists for you, Marc, is that this stuff doesn't hail from Africa or from the Far East. This stuff is cultivated within the West, and so that same love of self-criticism which I was praising, as it manifests in Socrates and as it has existed ever since Socrates, the West being in constant dialogue with itself, it can degenerate into a kind of self-hatred. It can degenerate into a self-criticism which is so strident that all of a sudden the West is giving birth to forms of political messianism which threaten to devour it from within.
Paul Gottfried describes it's a little bit of a bastardization of the term. That the new world is trying to be born, but it can't. I think that's so Gramscian. Now's the time of monsters, and he actually says, well, any new age is built on patricide, and so if you want to have a new age, then you need to kill the old one. And I think that's what you're seeing a lot now, basically, is that this kind of ritualistic slaughter of the past and disavowal of it.
Yes.
And again, even it shows how far we have fallen in that even conservative voices are still falling into that same kind of framework of being like tiptoeing around it. And I think unfortunately you do have to be somewhat dogmatic in your defence of the West, otherwise you're already kind of fighting a losing battle if you're constantly conceding, well, yes, this was very bad and this person was very bad and this intellectual tradition was evil, and well, that's not technically part of the West. Sometimes you do have to be a bit full-throated and kind of I
agree, but it's also important to emphasise that we should be if we are going to adopt this sort of bird's eye perspective, because you're saying we should refer to ourselves a little bit more, we shouldn't sort of write ourselves out of the story. I would agree with that, but even if we are going to refer to this sort of bird's eye perspective which tries to analyse the West from outside in sort of detached moral terms, we should be evaluating it on the basis of the ways in which it is unique not on the basis of the ways in which it's like everywhere else. So when the woke activists sort of trawl up slavery and colonialism and massacres, and I mean, there's nothing uniquely Western about any of that sort of stuff.
And in fact, I think the most distinctively Western things are the things. Those are the things actually, and this is where civilization gets a little complicated.
Yes.
Civilization, in many ways, except in the West, in some ways, is imperial, colonial, it often involves slavery, is oppressive, is centralized. The trap, in a way, of civilization is that the best way to become very wealthy and have a few people living in luxury and maybe doing a bit of sophisticated culture is to wildly oppress all your peasants. And I mean, you get stuck. You can't then do industrialization, which is why it never happened anywhere else. But the West didn't do that. And so actually the West, which is partly why I talk about the barbarians as sort of the beginning, the West was primitive for a really long time. China wasn't, India wasn't, the Arab world wasn't at the same time. But that sort of lack of oppression, that sort of decentralized civilization in a way, provided something really very different. And to the extent that the West has been oppressive, those have been the moments when it's fallen back into the more conventional ways of doing things in a way.
Which makes it just, which is to say nothing more than the West is composed of humans. The Western civilization has been made by human beings, just as every other civilization has been. And if we are, if we're going to focus on iconic figures like whether it's Abraham Lincoln or Winston Churchill, if we're going to evaluate them truly, we should be looking at the ways in which they were unique and the ways in which they were special and exceptional, not the fact that they, being human beings, had commonplace vices just like everyone else. That should be the focus.
Could I possibly ask who you've been interviewing? Because I know that Harrison's already been interviewed for the documentary, but I was wondering who else was contributing.
Yeah, it's been a thrill. I've had a chance to sit down with all sorts of really interesting people in the UK and the US, actually, because we've also been in the US. We filmed it in Washington, DC. So I was talking to Stanley Kurtz over there, who I think I mentioned earlier. I was talking with George Weigel. Very excitingly, we were talking with Andrew Klavan of the Daily Wire. He was absolutely terrific and really inspiring. So it was a wonderful moment in episode 2 where he talks about the Pietà, and it's Michelangelo's Pietà, and it's just beautiful. And there are moments like that. But people in the UK as well. Got the Telegraph columnist Zoe Strimple. We've got John O'Sullivan, sort of great conservative figure. I hardly remember them all. There are just so many. But it's really very exciting. Yeah.
So it's interesting you said that you've been filming. Have you been filming around Europe as well?
Yeah, we went to Rome and we went to Florence and all around the UK. We went up to Scotland to look at some of the sort of industrial heritage up there. We went to Cambridge. We went to see John Locke's grave out in Essex, and we went to the place where Magna Carta was sealed. One of the things that's very interesting is we found ourselves going to places that are slightly run down, places where the Americans in particular back in the 1950s put up plaques saying this was very important in the history of the West, and since then they've just slightly rusted. So it sort of made us feel like finally someone's going back.
So it was almost like a re-examination, a rediscovery of
a little bit.
But you said it's there are 6 whole episodes. How is it organised thematically?
It's sort of organised with a slight historical and thematic development. So as I say, it's starting with the fall of Rome. And sort of the first episode is introductory. It talks about this sort of very early culture of the barbarians, and it ends by talking about the importance of Christianity. And then the second episode looks at the influence of Christianity. This is the sort of thesis that Tom Holland and historians like Larry Siedentop have developed in recent years. And then we continue to sort of move forward in history, and then we're looking at the rule of law and the development of that, and some of the stuff about competition in Europe. So, and that's talking about Magna Carta and so forth. So that's the third episode. And then, gosh, let me see. The fourth episode is science and technology, the invention of science, if you like, itself, which was a thing that needed to be invented, but also the technological ingenuity, which stretches back into the Middle Ages. I look at spectacles and clocks, mechanical clocks, which are both extraordinary, very specifically Western inventions. And then the fifth episode is perhaps the most controversial in some ways. It deals with the age of discovery, slavery in the 19th century, empire, all of that. But more importantly, it argues the case for where the West's wealth really comes from, because this is an important conversation, right? This is the claim. It's the Williams thesis. It's sometimes called. It's all about slavery. Slavery is the basis for capitalism. It's why you're rich. You exploited people in the colonies, and it's simply not true.
No.
Well, as you said, it's the complete opposite.
Yeah.
You know, in a way, if you were to remain a slave-owning society, you were massively held back by it. I
Well,
mean, you can look at the example of the American South.
The South
for
lost the Civil War.
Right, exactly.
It was an
And
agrarian backwater.
Speaking of who I interviewed, I was absolutely delighted to be able to sit down with Nigel Biggar just before his
Oh
book on
yes, his
colonialism.
book.
Great.
Yeah, it was a week before the book came out, so
Oh,
he was
wonderful.
primed with all the arguments, and we had a wonderful conversation. So that was a real thrill.
Another very useful shorthand way of discrediting the thesis that the West's treasure the West's wealth is fundamentally based on oppression. And I mean, again, to go back to the point, I mean, slavery and colonialism were the least inventive things that the West did. I mean, everyone had been doing that for centuries. You're going to have to answer the question: well, why did the Arab world not become, supremely wealthy? Why did the Mongolian Empire not become supremely wealthy? Clearly, it can't be put down to slavery and colonialism, because everyone was engaged in that, and it was the West which advanced ahead of the rest.
And it's so important to discuss this now. I mean, it shouldn't even have to, but it is. Because it has ramifications for us.
Yeah.
If we allow the lie to be propagated that the West has only ever been wealthy and successful off the backs of other people who were involved in chattel slavery, then that makes the question of something like reparations almost a settled debate. Because then how could you possibly defend not giving reparations if the entire wealth of the country that we're living in today is off the backs of other people who we exploited? That's why it's really, really important that we do have voices like yours and your contributors kind of saying, like, this is just complete ahistorical nonsense. It's what people want to believe, not what actually is the case.
Absolutely, and I talk a bit about capitalism as well, because of course the real source of the wealth is about increased productivity.
Right.
It's about capitalism.
And
it's
competition,
about
economic
division of
competition.
labour,
Yeah.
Adam Smith, and so on.
Sure.
So I think it's really exciting to make that argument. So very pleased with that. And then we round off the series.
Oh, yes, sorry.
No, there's so much. We round off the series with episode 6, and that looks at the Enlightenment and the sort of dueling Enlightenments of the Scottish and the French, if
Well,
you like.
indeed, yes.
And that gets into
Yeah.
the question of that revolutionary tradition, the Marxism and
course.
communism and those horrors, and argues, really, which the whole series is arguing,
Sure.
that it's that rooted idea of the West, that idea of we understand where we come from, but we want to try and make it better. It's not finished.
Sure,
We're always
sure.
going somewhere forward. That's how you do it. That's how the
Yes.
Scottish Enlightenment did it, which led to America in many ways, and it's not how the French Enlightenment, the sort of year zero thing,
Yes.
worked.
Yes.
At the end, really, I'm optimistic. Some people talk about the West and they're despairing, but
Yes.
one of the things that I found working on this series is that it reminded me that the West, it's always in trouble,
Yes.
but it always finds a way
Yes.
through, and I think
Yeah.
we should be confident in it, and perhaps that confidence comes when you stop thinking, oh, it's all gone, it's all going away, and remember that there's no reason to think that. The West's best days are still ahead of it.
You make such a good point. Whenever I do read historical texts of writing, for example, at the time of the Civil War, people constantly bemoaning that everything is lost, all is gone. And we do find ourselves in a very difficult situation at the moment, and we shouldn't downplay that. But I think documentaries like yours do place that in a broader historical context, and I hope will probably bring viewers out of that kind of mire of fatalism and depression, and to say, this heritage that we all share is worth fighting for, and it's worth defending.
Yeah, and just to show people it again, because I think sometimes
It's
part of
ignorance.
when these series don't happen, you just don't encounter the material. When Kenneth Clark's Civilization came out, it was one of the great new things on colour TV.
Yes.
And suddenly, after in the midst of the sort of after the post-war gloom,
Sure.
in everyone's living room, they suddenly got the treasures of Western civilization in like full colour. It was just this amazing, beautiful thing, even without his narrative. And I hope we've been able to do something of that. It's just a little encounter with these beautiful things, whether it's the more famous ones like Michelangelo's David, or something more obscure like the Frank's casket, which I talk about in episode 1, which is this whale ivory carved thing in the British Museum, which is just fascinating. And you see there this strange medley of influences. You get the Anglo-Saxon, you get these runes, this sort of bit of barbarians, bit of Romulus and Remus, the classical tradition you were talking about, and then at the centre of it, the Magi coming to the Christ child. And you see all those things coming together in this still quite primitive, this very early piece. But you see, that's the West, the fusion of these things.
Encapsulated into kind of one object.
Yes.
Yes.
So this is coming out on Sunday, Marc. Why should people go to watch it?
I hope they will be surprised, because it looks at the narrative that they may think they know in a new way. I think they should be inspired by it, and I hope they should be intrigued. They should be reminded that there was something that we used to talk about, and there's no reason that we can't continue to talk about it today, that the West can be remade and remodeled in a fashion that speaks to us in the 21st century and will continue to speak to us. And that if we stop engaging with it and just say, we don't really need that, we'll move on to some new narrative, we may find that we've discarded the most valuable things that we didn't realise we were throwing away. Things like free speech, things like liberal democracy, even perhaps science. And we'll be reminded of that if we just hold on to the West. So we just need to encounter its strangeness and its power and its wildness and the beauty of the things that it makes.
Splendid. I won't add anything to that. Nothing needs to be added to that.
Well, thank you very much, Marc. That was wonderful. So just to remind us again, you can watch the first episode on Sunday. And when are the next episodes coming out?
They should be coming out every week after that.
Every week on Sunday. Wonderful. Well, thank you again, Marc. And I'm Poppy. This is my co-host, Harrison. And you've been watching Deprogrammed.
Hello. If you're enjoying the New Culture Forum channel and you believe in our mission, may I invite you to join our membership scheme at the link below or on our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Our work is more important now than ever, and we have great plans ahead for the future, but we can't do it without your support. From as little as £3 per month, you can help ensure that we continue on our mission. As a member, you'll receive a range of benefits, including access to exclusive content, invitations to our private events, including here at our studios, free copies of our books, and much, much more, including, of course, our famous NCF mug. If you aren't able to become a member, then please help us by clicking this button and subscribing to our channel. It's completely free. Just remember to also click the bell icon so that you can get notifications when we post new videos. Thank you.